Okay, welcome everyone to the latest meeting of the Member Advisory Group. We'll move on straight away to the agenda, and the first item is apologies for absence, please.
Chair, we have apologies from Councillor Nathan England. His substitute this evening is Councillor Eileen Kalia.
Thank you. Just the one? Yep.
Yeah.
Thank you. Any declarations of interest? No. Lovely, thank you very much. Moving on then to the minutes of the previous meeting. I assume we've all had time to read and immerse ourselves. Any comments, please? Is it your wish that I go forward and sign the minutes?
Yes, move them.
Thank you very much. I shall do that now. Okay. I forgot what the date was then. Lovely. Thank you very much. Thank you. Okay, move on to the next item, which is a report from the commissioning body, Evershed Sutherland, to talk about the appointment of the chair and general update, to which I will pass across to Sarah and Izzy to comment.
Thank you. Well, hopefully everybody's aware that we have now appointed a chair. I don't propose to go through the report line by line, but happy to deal with any questions either in relation to the report or the appointment process itself.
Thank you. Any comments from anyone on that particular item? We're all happy? That's lovely. In that case, I shall move the recommendations, which are all on page 6. I'm looking at the original copy, by the way. You may have the updated copy, in which case it may not be. We're on page 10 of the. No, it's that one. Are we happy with the recommendations?
Yes.
Okay. Can we have a block? All those in favour? That's unanimous. Thank you very much. We shall then move on to the next part, which is a report again from the commissioning body on the design of the inquiry process, to update members on the design of the process as part of Part B in the final commission. Again, across to Evershed Sutherland, please.
Thank you. I think the most important thing to say in relation to this process report is that it's very early stages in our work at the moment. And so because we were contractually obliged to do so, we've put pen to paper to set out our very preliminary thoughts. And they are preliminary and very big picture, but I'm very happy to deal with any questions on that to the extent that I'm able to at this stage.
Excellent, thank you. So, questions please, members. Councillor Nelson.
If no other members have questions.
You're first to come up, so please do.
Okay. Right now, first want to praise the work. It's very, very thorough, very, very detailed, and the reports are very clearly written. And I'm also conscious that, and I'll say it here now, there are some other points later on of clarification that I'll be looking for. But we are pledged to work with the administration and the council, and that's been a pledge that's made in public, and I want to stand by that. I probably will have some questions, but I think I'm going to try and pose them in the form of looking for clarification. Perhaps the lawyers in the room are used to an adversarial environment, and the politicians certainly are, the public less so. So if I could ask the chair, please to bear with me, I'm wanting to be as constructive as I can. Well, in that regard, and it's an extremely minor point, but I found a typo, and it's the only one I could find. I think that's a bit of a first.
I'll take one.
You'll take one. Well, the inquiry process, point 5, page 12, it says they chair, and it's probably the chair. But I tell you what, it's the only one I could find. And that's only to demonstrate. A question I would have, though, regarding point 8, where it says the inquiry process will therefore have to remain flexible. Absolutely right, and that flexibility is stressed throughout and came out of the public consultation session, where the independent chair was, to my mind, very flexible indeed about timescale, for instance. That it'll be the appropriate, correct timescale. it mention is made of regular progress reports. Do you have any feel at all for what regular means in that context?
It's a really fair question, Councillor, and we ummed and ahed about whether being specific in relation to this, should we say we'll do it every quarter, every month? I think it's difficult because until the inquiry is underway, we don't know the extent to which we're going to get engagement from all of the stakeholders. So it could be that we put in here, well, we're going to do a report every month, and what if actually there isn't sufficient progress? And so it's not that we're wanting to be vague, and we hope that once we get into the inquiry there will become a pattern. But what we would really like to do before we commit ourselves in relation to that is get our hands on some documentation, which we hopefully can do once we've finalised the terms of reference, because then we'll have a much better idea of the size of task that lies ahead, the number of witnesses we might need to engage with, what we think that might look like in terms of timescale. So what I would say in relation to that is we will be happy to come back to that as we move forward.
Absolutely. I mean, I was expecting that you'd be saying that there's an anticipation of reasonableness. So weekly is not reasonable.
No.
Six monthly probably isn't reasonable either.
Exactly.
So it might be something in between the two.
Yeah.
Thank you very much indeed. That's it. Thank
Okay,
you. Thank you very
Any
much.
other comments anyone wishes to ask at this point? Councillor Bentley.
I noticed there's an extensive distribution of leaflets within this, but I also noticed that rural areas don't seem to be included, in which case I think there's a large proportion of the population potentially not being made aware. I would also have liked to have seen leaflets left, at least in A&E, at the Princess Royal.
Okay. Have any specific other areas where you'd like to sort of have seen leaflets?
Well, yeah, there's plenty of areas within rural areas that could have gone in, village halls, shops, various things like that, that haven't been included. As I say, I know you've got an extensive sort of list here, but the rural area seems to have been negated, other than Newport. Not everybody's dropping into Newport.
Sorry, we seem to have jumped onto the next agenda item, have we?
Just to a little bit, isn't it, really, which... We'll note what you said, Stephen, and then we'll come back to it if you don't mind. Is that okay? Anyone else wish to make any comment on this part?
Which is
Carry
shameful,
on.
and I wrote it down. Well, no, not at all. On the schedule, which is commendably clear, I looked up Maxwellisation, and I remember reading my history about the bouncing cheque, but Robert Maxwell. But perhaps clarification of Maxwellisation?
Yeah.
Not probably appropriate.
No, yeah, and
Well, for the members of
yeah,
whoever.
and just to say before we go into that, there will be lots of terminology as we move forward. It's something that we were talking about just earlier in relation to the terms of reference themselves. So I think it's important to point out that as soon as we're able to, we will be putting documentation on the website with definitions, frequently asked questions, that sort of thing, because we accept that there's an element of this that is a legalistic process, and so we will do our best. But Maxwellisation is all about notifying people of potential criticisms before those criticisms are made public. And so all inquiries have to go through this process whereby before a criticism is made of somebody, let's say in the final report, that could be a person or it could be an organisation, prior notice is given to that individual or that organisation so they have the opportunity, because it's the fair thing to do, for them to respond to that criticism. Now, that doesn't mean it all has to be left to the end. It is possible to do Maxwellisation as you go forward with an inquiry process whereby you are notified of a criticism and then you engage with that person that has been criticised to get their response to that criticism.
Thank you very much.
Okay, actually, I looked up Maxwellisation as well because I didn't know what it was. I'll be perfectly honest. Thank you very much. Any other comments, please, at this stage? If not, we will move on to the final part, which, as we know, is a report from the commissioning body on the inquiry's terms of reference. Have we all had an opportunity to read them? Because I know they've been late to most people. Have we all had a chance to read? Okay, if you'd like to just give some background, please.
Yeah, and just picking up on that point about timeframes, because I think that's a good place to start. We completely appreciate that the timeframes that people have had to look at this has been short. We wouldn't have done that by choice. But we are where we are in terms of the calendar for the year. And I think we're probably all keen that this inquiry can now start to make some progress. And so it was really important for us to try to fit the consultation period in before the summer break, if at all possible. So we're really grateful for everybody that's bared with us and kind of read through this overnight. So we're really happy to take questions, comments. I know that the Survivors Committee have got some, but perhaps we can start elsewhere in the room and come back to the Survivors Committee at the end.
Okay, thank you very much. Members then, please, Councillor Blundell.
Yeah, I've got a question as to the consultation responses on the 2nd of July. It stressed the importance of ensuring the inquiry looks at current CSE issues. How will the inquiry continue to engage with the public? Are there plans to make sure that the contact details and phone lines, because not everybody wants to turn up in person or put it in writing. Will there be an inquiry telephone number in the Telford Journal, say for instance, or the Shropshire Star? As I did wonder why it was actually in the West Midlands Metro but not in the local papers, bearing in mind that we're obviously trying to catch people who may still not be aware of the inquiry but may be a survivor.
Yeah, it's a fair point. We talked about where to do the advertising, you know, how much do you do, because there's obviously costs associated with that advertising. We felt the Metro would have the widest remit in the timeframes that we were working to. But we've got a lot of work to do in relation to publicising the work of the inquiry, and that can take all sorts of different forms. We appreciate not everybody's got access to the internet, so we will, once we've got the terms of reference finalised, be putting together a programme in terms of getting the word out there that effectively the inquiry is open for business. And we've got all sorts of different thoughts as to how we might do that, so your suggestions are appreciated.
Just one follow-up, because obviously engaging with schools I think is also important, that the youngsters know that they can find somewhere to go to or some contact details.
And that's a point that came out actually on the consultation evening, so that's something that the school's point in particular that we have noted, so we'll give that some thought.
Okay, thank you. Any other questions, please? Andy, do you wish to?
No, you first, please.
Oh, do you want to just...
Please,
okay,
lady
Andy,
first.
please. Sorry.
I shouldn't have said that either. Can't do what we're doing right now.
We had a meeting yesterday where the Survivors Committee came together. There was 12 in total, with also people contactable via phone. It was there was 3 points really that they wanted to raise today. One was on point 1, and that would be where, as well as anybody who holds relevant information. Now I know we've emailed and that can be worded in a slightly different way, but we wanted to make sure there was a bit of clarity that it was for victims, survivors and parents, as well as people holding relevant information. We thought it needed to be made clearer. On point 2.5, the local taxi industry and taxi licensing, we wanted to add, without listing them all, but we wanted to add, well, I'm speaking on behalf of the survivors, the nighttime economy. And then on 2.16, we wanted the words, how Councillor Bamron's already picked up about education providers and care homes to be included.
Okay.
And then the Survivors Committee felt very strongly on this point, and it was unanimously rejected at the point of the time frame of 1995. Every member of the current Survivors Committee feels that the time limitation is unnecessary and insignificant. We propose again the time to be changed to a focus at beginning from 1898, excuse me. I'll recorrect myself. 1989, when the Children Act was established in Section 22 of the Children Act 1989. It sets out a general duty to the local authority looking after children to safeguard, promote and welfare of the child. This is relevant and an integral part of the past failings which have come to the Council, be incorporate parents, along with statutory guidance sets out the local authorities must do within the law. We therefore propose the time frame be changed to 1989 onwards, with all the survivors and victims and families and members of others wishing to give evidence prior based on 1989, having their witness accounts heard and relevant documentation sought and treated in the same manner as those who were victims, survivors and family members of other relevant witnesses more recently. Sorry for that long-winded, but we needed to make it clear that the point why and why that particular date as well, because it coincides with the Children's Act.
So Sarah, do you think those can be accommodated?
Yeah, so I think if we just part the time frame one for a moment, because I think that's a wider discussion in relation to all of the others. We've had a look at those. Some of them are drafting points where we can just make the drafting a little bit clearer. In relation to the nighttime economy, that would be another one where what we would need is somewhere a definition of what is meant by that. We've got no issue including that wording in the terms of reference, but we would need to be clear on what is meant by that. That can sit in a separate document. So we have no issue with any of those. We don't have an issue with the time frame point, but I think it's probably an opportune time for me to explain why we got to where we did with the time frame. And I think the first thing to explain is that it was never our intention to exclude cases before 1995. What we are trying to do is be pragmatic about the work that the inquiry faces. And I often talk about work of inquiries as being a balancing act, because there are time and cost considerations that have to be taken account of. And the broader the terms of reference become, of course, the more time things take and the more they cost. And that's not obviously always the most important thing, but it is there as something we need to think about. And what we wanted to do was achieve a situation whereby anybody could come forward and tell the inquiry their story, and we would do what we could to then find the documentation, but be realistic about the fact that the further back we go, the less likely that documentation is to exist. But to have a period whereby when we take the next step, which will be to write to all of the stakeholders and say, here are our terms of reference, can we now please have all of the documentation that you hold that is relevant to the terms of reference. We were making the time frame as reasonable as possible for that request, because otherwise our concern was that the volume of documentation could be vast. And it's hard, I'm dealing with unknowns. I don't know the volumes of documentation that we might face if we say 1995 or 1989 or earlier, I don't know, I'm just guessing. So we were just trying to be pragmatic about the implications, not only for us as an inquiry team, but also for all of those stakeholders that have then got to find that documentation. So wherever we land with that date, you could say it's an arbitrary date, you know, where do we draw the line in the sand in relation to that? And for us, taking on board all of the things that we heard at the consultation evening, all of the responses that we've had, that seemed like a sensible place for us to land in relation to that. As I say, totally keeping the door open for anybody to come forward. So I think there's two different points there. One is to clarify the drafting so that it would be clear that we are not closing the door to people coming forward and us then trying to find their documentation pre-1985, or we just review that time frame, and that is something that I'm more than willing to have a conversation about, but I think it's just important that everybody understands why we got to where we did.
Okay. Andy, are you happy with that response?
No. They were quite adamant that it's to be in line with the Children's Act. I'm happy on what I heard yesterday that the drafting is made more clear about cases coming forward from pre-80s, 90s will be looked at an individual basis, and also which was concluded at the open evening when the chair sort of said that they were based then on case studies and be learned. But I think it was clear from the meeting yesterday, and I speak on behalf of the survivors, that they wanted to be quite succinct with the Children's Act.
Okay. Thank you. Well, before we finish the meeting tonight, we will obviously agree that we're all happy to go forward, so we will come back to that if you don't mind. So, Councillor Bedley.
I would say on that point, this entire inquiry is predicated on total involvement of the survivors and the victims. Therefore, I think we should be considering respecting the wishes given I understand your answer, and I would support what they're asking for.
Okay, thank you.
Point. If we look at the, and I'll come to this in some points I want to make, but if we look at the specific context of why we're here, why there is an inquiry at all, it was partly because there were people who'd not had catharsis. They didn't feel they'd had their voices heard properly. And then there were statistics about current instances, albeit that perhaps they were reporting, not reporting facts, as it were. So this inquiry process is satisfying two needs. One is for people who didn't have their say or weren't listened to or were subject to injustice, having the chance to have that recognised. And if there were past failings, and past failings are made reference to numerous times in the words, they're not my words, then they will be recognised. And then the other part in the original wording way back was current. So can something be done to reduce harm now? And can an inquiry contribute to that? Because it might be another, outlet's the wrong word, but whatever the right word is, for people to have their voice. So if in the context of the first two criteria, is that the Victim and Survivor Committee themselves are saying a particular date, I think we should be extremely mindful of that. I really do. Who's the inquiry for?
Well, yes, and whose terms and conditions are they as well, in terms of who is going to manage them and who are they for. You're quite right. Have you finished your comments, or you got more?
I've got other things to do with the terms of reference.
While you've got the floor, please carry on.
Okay, thank you. Just a piece of my understanding for the context that what the inquiry can achieve is investigation observation. You can't execute anything. You require the public authorities outside this room, some of them may not be in this room, but outside this room and maybe listening, you never know, to then execute against recommendations. So that's the police, for instance. Yeah. And I hope the police are very aware that there may be new needs created, there may be new witnesses come forward, there may be new things that need to be done, and perhaps the council as well. In terms of reference, I am supportive of your proposed new date. Equally, we're very conscious, and we've stressed that opportunity the inquiry presents to mitigate current harm. So we've said that it needs to cover current instances, and I'm praising the terms of reference. I'm not presuming to change anything, but perhaps to identify some things. In most instances, the terms of reference make it very clear that the process does cover potential current cases, which is good. And indeed, in terms of reading the timescale, there's a bit of lawyer's language. The footnote 1, the date not being earlier than the appointment of the commissioning body. One can interpret that, my lord, to say also no later than that date, though that's pretty current. However, I would be perhaps making an assumption, so challenge my assumption, that since the timescale proposes to be taking witness submissions through till Q3 2020, I believe I've understood that properly, then current could it be as far into the future as at least Q3 2020? Is that a reasonable assumption? Thank you. Okay, in other words, current. That's great. Thank you very much indeed. So in that context, there are just one or two very small points in the TOR then, which are close-ended with regard to timing. Am I okay to go through this, Mr. Chairman? Is this okay? So if we take, for instance, 2.4, where it refers to attitude and changes in attitude, it is saying including when and how. It doesn't say whether. So I think there's a fairly strong assumption that they have changed, which is great. Okay, but I'll just, yeah. More to the point, 3, in relation to matters set out above paragraph 4, The inquiry will identify if there were any organisational and systemic failures, but there might be also are. They may, I don't know how members feel about that. That's just saying we're only going to look at the ones in the past, but we notice there's glaring systemic failures now, but they're not in our TOR, potentially. I don't know how you feel about that.
I think that's a fair point. It wasn't intended to exclude any current ones, so we will take that on board.
Probably was, so yeah, that's great. Well, I'm sure it wasn't, sorry. I'm sure it wasn't. And I'll stop now because I'm sure I've said far too much. But in terms of 6, it refers to evidential findings. Indeed, it's one of the powers that an inquiry has, that you are taking evidence. The independent chair made reference at the public consultation event that you would also be making evidential reportings where necessary. Yes? So if you heard something that needs acting on, you won't sit on it to the end of the inquiry. Did I understand that properly?
No, you're quite correct. So we're going to have to be very clear with people about what happens to information that is provided to us, and that will sit within a separate document.
Absolutely, because I've written to myself for that. It then has got massive questions of confidentiality. You make reference yourselves to why people have no choice but to go along with perpetrators, and one of those is fear. And that's my point about the public authorities and their role to prevent people from being in a position of fear, and are they doing that? I'm not expressing this very well, but I think you probably get the idea of where I'm coming from. Okay. Otherwise, that the terms of reference cover off, many positive outcomes.
Thank you very much. Okay. Anyone else wish to comment on the terms of reference? Yes, carry on.
Just a quick comment regarding the Survivors Committee's request. Obviously, Eversheds have come up with the time frame based on many different sort of needs that need to be met. But I would ask if they can take into account the survivors' request, and if so, can it be done in a time frame that would allow for this still to go to Cabinet?
Yes.
Brilliant.
Okay, thank you. Any further comment on that? I think that's an important point, because what we don't want to do really is miss the next Cabinet meeting, because otherwise we're 2 more months before anything actually happens, and we can't really afford that. So hearing from members at the moment and from the Survivors Committee, it does seem very important that the 1989 date is set in stone within those terms of reference. Do you think that can happen?
I mean, there's no right or wrong answer, I don't think, in relation to this date. As I say, it's always going to be arbitrary wherever we land in relation to that. So as long as everybody understands why we made the decision that we did, and the implications of moving that date, or the possible implications of moving that date, then we as the commissioning body, and we've already spoken to the chair about this, have no issue with changing that date.
Okay, thank you, because I think we all realise that it would mean more time, more money, more work for everybody involved. But what are we trying to do here? We're trying to do the job that the inquiry set out to do, and if it means going back a few more years, then I think that's the will of this committee. It's a will of the Survivors Committee. So
it's been a trait through the whole, since I've been involved, it's been a continual trait of that time frame.
okay.
And I would just say, in respect to the drafting and making it clear that there is no end date or cut-off date in respect of catharsis for the victims and survivors, we will make that clear in the drafting, because it sounds like that hasn't come across as clear as it could, so that there is no cut-off date in respect of hearing from victims and survivors, whether that be before 1989 or not, but we can agree with the
We've
chair.
really heard from members that there is a desire that it goes back further than 1995, and it must, I think, in that respect. Does anyone else wish to comment?
Sorry, naturally, if there's something I've forgotten again, I do apologise, Mr. Chairman.
No, that's what you're here for, thank you.
Point 2.3, the history of changes made to practice policy and investigation, and there absolutely have been changes. That's a fact, and improvements. That's a fact. There've been changes and improvements, and the sufficiency of such changes. How do you propose to measure the sufficiency of those changes. And if it's not simple to answer, then don't try and answer. But it just struck me, yeah, I bet we all wish to know how. Yeah, but how do you know?
It's not going to be an easy one, Councillor,
Okay,
that's for
thank
sure.
you.
But until we start to unpick it,
Fine, thank
Who
you very
knows?
much indeed. No, that's okay. Just thank you. Thank you.
you.
Yeah.
Any further comment on the terms of reference, please? Because if that's the case, based on what's been said, what's been fed back to Evershed Sutherland, are we all happy that these terms of reference goes forward to Cabinet on Thursday?
With the changes.
With the changes that we've put forward being listened to and addressed.
Yeah.
On those, can I have a show of hands on that, please? Thank you. I think that's pretty obvious where we wanted to go. Thank you, everybody, for your time, your input, and your efforts on this. The meeting is now closed. Thank you.